Thank you all very much for being here. Is there anyone in this room who was not yet familiar with the Special Ed Task Force at all? So you got a nice introduction here from Patty about what it is. We were incredibly fortunate to have our president of the State Board of Education and the chair of the commission, Linda Darling-Hammond and Mike Kirst, so concerned about the results for children with disabilities in the state that they said, we need to do something, but we don't know what it is yet. So could we get some people together and talk about it and figure out, what are the barriers? What's going wrong? Why aren't we getting to what we need to do for our children with disabilities in California? And so I had the great honor to be asked to serve as the co-executive director with Dr. Vicki Barber. And we led a group of people for 2 years to really look at all of the barriers and issues. And so we are here to tell you about that and our recommendations. We actually don't have all of the recommendations here because there were a lot, but we are going to give you the access to the reports so you can read as much more as you want to. But we really wanted to highlight for you today recommendations in multiple areas. So here, you've just been introduced to who we are. So this was our job, is how would we improve both services and specifically outcomes for students with disabilities. And our report did come out in March 2015, and we did provide it to every single state legislator and other people in the state. So really what we heard from people, because we had 6 hearings around the state where we invited anybody and everybody who had concerns to come tell us, what are those concerns? What do you think is getting in the way, and what are your ideas? And what we heard over and over is that we really need to have a one system approach where students are students first. They're general education students before they're special ed students. They are in addition a special ed student, and maybe they're an English learner, and maybe there's other parts to them, but they're always general ed student first. And so we need one system of education that would be a seamless provider of the supports necessary to students and to get those services to students as soon as possible. Another thing that we heard over and over, particularly from teachers, is, and I'll differentiate between special ed teachers and general ed teachers here for a minute. General ed teachers told us, we don't know what to do. We are not adequately prepared to work with students in the classroom when they come. We have 30 kids, and then we have some additional responsibilities. We really are not very well prepared to work with every child who comes into our classroom. And then special ed teachers told us, and with that change that California made to having a special ed credential that doesn't require the general ed credential first, we're not authorized by the Commission on Teacher Credentialing, which looks at what your credential allows you to do. We're not authorized to work with kids in a pre-referral kind of way, and that's creating problems. So what we found is that there were really 2 silos, and it was very hard to go between those, and we needed all educators to be prepared to work with all students. And then we wanted those expectations to be high. If we're going to have students actually reach incredible outcomes, we need to prepare them, and we need to have everybody working together to do the best that we can for all students. So we did identify lots of different barriers, and one of them was simply huge differences in access. So if I lived in LA, I might have one set of opportunities, but if I lived in the Coachella Valley, they might be very different options. And that might be true for 3 to 5-year-olds. It might be true in a K-12 system. It might be true in transition. Not all districts have workability. There were all kinds of examples where the access to services was not available equally. And then I mentioned this issue about the preparation for teachers also being different, and so the requirements are different, and that kind of helped make this silo. But then we also discovered that there are silos not just between general education and special education, but also with agencies, and there's a lot of cross-agency work that we need to do. This is a great example of people coming together from various walks to be able to try to work together, and we recognize that we want to see that improved. And then another huge barrier was, and this is also an access issue, but for preschool, again, depending on where you live and what your school district has to offer, we do not have enough high quality and inclusive preschool options for young children. One of our issues as special educators is that we're responsible to provide services in the least restrictive environment, and if you don't have a least restrictive environment preschool, it's pretty hard to give those special ed services in a preschool setting. So those were some of the barriers identified. So one of the first tasks that Vicki and I had to do was think about how are we going to organize this work group. We had over 200 applicants to sit on this task force, and we tried to pick the range of diversity in California to be represented. So we ended up with 34 people and liaisons from both the Commission and the Legislative Analyst's Office and the Senate and the Assembly and the Department of Education. And so when we were in a meeting room together, we were about 55 people. And you can't have one conversation with 55 people. So we decided that the thing to do would be to set up different subcommittees within our committee and give them very specific tasks, both to identify these barriers and to make recommendations. And so these are the groups, the subcommittees. We did not have a specific family and student engagement subcommittee because that was something that was mentioned in every single one of our subcommittees. But in the report, we do have a separate section because so many things came up about supporting families and students. So those were the areas. So what we'd like to do here, and Kristin isn't standing over there because she's waiting in line, but we're going to switch because I'm going to say the recommendations and she's going to give you the update on what is it that is happening in those specific areas until we get to the commission language, and Teri will take over that. So our first recommendation was to improve access to and coordination of high quality early care and preschool for all. So Kristin, you want to tell us about that?
So something that I saw as very promising and hopeful was an initial response from the governor and the budget that occurred right after the task force recommendations came out. And within that budget proposal was a number of sort of signals that we hear you, we understand that money drives some things, and so we're going to allocate some provisions in this budget that will hopefully further these recommendations. And the first one is around the preschool, and there are 2,500 slots for part-day preschool that I believe just went out to the field just this year. And as Maureen said, you know, this is definitely a step in the right direction. A bigger issue for us as a state is, and you've heard a lot of these conversations around the conversations about universal preschool, is that if we're required as a state and under IDEA to serve 3 to 5-year-olds with disabilities in preschool, but we're not required to serve all kids, we have a problem. We don't have those inclusive environments or necessarily those public school offerings because it isn't uniform across all districts in California. And there are some districts who have decided to use their funds under their local control accountability plans to put preschool as a priority, so they do have more of these options, but that is not necessarily a requirement because we have local control of our school budgets in California. So this was an initial signal saying, yes, we understand that there needs to be more slots allocated, and part of that is the funding that comes along with students with disabilities, understanding that it takes more support to serve children, especially children with more significant disabilities in inclusive settings. So I think this is a great first step, and we have a lot of work to do in this area because, as you know, inclusion in preschool sets the tone not only for our teachers in our schools, but also for our family members and our other community members of kids without disabilities who have an expectation then they were in preschool with us, why are they not moving along through K-12? So when we start off in segregation, we sort of head down a path that seems to look very similar. So I think we can all do some advocacy work in this area, for certain in our own districts as well as at a state level.
So continuing on in the early learning category, One of the things that is very unfortunate in California is that we are not adequately funded for special education preschool either. And so one of our other recommendations was to update those formulas in order to try to address this issue of access and equity. Anne?
So there was an adjustment in 2013 around factors for childcare, which added an additional amount to childcare. However, from the adjustment for K-12 or pre-K-12, currently the Public Policy Institute of California is doing a study on special ed funding to look at whether or not our current model for special ed funding is really consistent with local control, because our system for special ed funding is regionalized through our SELPAs, and districts get all their other money directly. So there's some questions just around, and as you also probably know, students with disabilities were not part of the local control funding formula, LCFF, and so that's caused some issues for our stakeholders around how do you get involved in your local district conversations when you're not weighted or you don't have that extra say, and where do students with disabilities fit into the mix. And interestingly, students with disabilities are part of the accountability system around the local control funding formula, so there's been some confusion about how do you make sure that students with disabilities, in terms of when you're doing school and LEA programming, how do you make sure that you've accounted for students with disabilities as one of your subgroups or your disadvantaged subgroups when they're not technically foster youth, students that are socioeconomically disadvantaged, or English learners? So those conversations will be happening in this fall, and we'll be looking to you for input, and I think there will be some input sessions happening around how does our funding support our philosophy around how we're serving students, and maybe we want to keep things the same and maybe we don't, but those are the conversations that'll be happening.
One thing that I would add about the point about what the LCFF dollars go for is that probably a year and a half ago or more, there was an analysis done of students with disabilities and how many of them were English learners, foster youth, or children of poverty. And there's a very significant overlap. I think it's 70%.
It's a 70% that are in one or more of the LCFF categories also. So we're not talking about a separate subgroup of kids that are here. We're talking about our kids that are a lot of things.
Right. So another recommendation from the early learning group was to try to develop, and we didn't say who would be responsible to do this, but we felt that we needed family-friendly protocols for the transition from Part C to Part B, which is when a child turns 3 and their eligibility and their service provider often changes. And that's a big area of difficulty for lots of families. So one recommendation was that we try to support that transition more successfully.
And I think this is an area, and Teresa Casa-Johansson from the department, I think, is out here, and I know that they've been working on trying to have more cross-department collaboration, but that's definitely an area of need.
So our next recommendation was that because we have so many different kinds of programs in early learning, that we wanted all of the different providers to use evidence-based, developmentally appropriate program standards. Because depending on where you go to school and who was trained to do what, that was a significant difference for different children 3 to 5.
So in speaking with the director of the early learning division, DRDP is the expectation from the CDE perspective, but it's not cross-agency. And so that's some of the work that we need to do as a state so that that's part of that alignment work that I think the task force was illuminating.
And so that's really the second half of this one too, is that we have common assessments that are actually really usable for informing instruction. You don't want to assess children unless you're going to use that data to actually help them. And so there had been some issues that a lot of the required kinds of assessments were really not as useful as we wanted them to be. And so that was one recommendation there.
Before we go to evidence-based practices, do you want me to share a little bit about the Commission in early learning?
Yes, please. Thank you for reminding us.
So the Commission is responsible for licensing of educators, and preschool teachers who work in state preschools need to hold a child development permit, which that's a 6-level permit structure. And unfortunately, that permit hasn't been looked at since the early 1990s until this past year. So, built upon the work of the Special Ed Statewide Task Force, there was a bill that said the commission should look at the permit structure, and we're in the middle of that process. Next month or so, I believe we'll have a survey out to the field, and we really are interested because there's been some recommendations about how to modify the preparation of individuals who work in our preschools. So watch for that survey. And we think they'll be finishing their work in the coming months. I think there'll still be 5 or 6 levels to this permit, but right now it's just completely based on 6 regionally accredited units, 12 units, 24 units. It's very open and broad. And we don't feel that that really provides the best preparation for our teachers for this essential group of our students. And so the commission is in the process of that, and there will be an updated permit structure coming up in this next year. So hopefully they'll be better prepared teachers.
Thank you. So our next subcommittee was the evidence-based practices group, and frankly, I think they had the biggest job because there is so much research out there, which is great. We do know, we have information about what's the right thing to do, when and where, but it's not universally implemented because not everybody knows that the information isn't out to everybody. So we had a lot of recommendations in this area. So one of them that is an evidence-based practice is called Universal Design for Learning, and it is really the basis that any instruction needs to be accessible and understood by the learner in order to be effectively an effective instruction way. So we wanted UDL, Universal Design for Learning, to be understood, better trained, better informed. And then there's also a lot of information. You've probably heard a lot about RTI, or response to instruction, or response to instruction and intervention. And we saw that as a part of a multi-tiered system of support, which really would provide tiered levels of interventions in an RTI model, but in a bigger picture that would include behavior, that would include social emotional learning, for example. And so we highly recommended that there be a system put in place that would allow everybody who works in education to be better informed in these areas. In fact, going back to our teacher preparation subcommittee, we started that committee by calling it teacher preparation, and then we said, well, really, it's educator preparation. And then we said, and you know what, there's a bunch of teachers already in the field, so it's really educator preparation and professional learning. So this particular recommendation had to do with the fact that we have so many people trained in the field already, and we need to get all of this information to them. And so we have lots of updates on what's happened with that from Kristin.
So the great thing about multi-tiered system of supports and MTSS is that it really fits well with framing how LEAs, local educational agencies, and districts can look at their LCAPs, their local control accountability plans, because really local control accountability plans is the framing for all the different supports and services and programs and delivery of education to the kids of each district. And so the intention to look at it in this way around a tier 1 being a very universally designed, very accessible general education. From a special education perspective, we can't build on a faulty foundation. No one can. And so if we have a foundation that is reaching a lot of students, and we have teachers that are very well prepared to teach a lot of students, then our special education is truly special. And so one of the signals in the governor's budget, 2 years in a row now, the first year we were able to put out a request to the field to help us at the Department of Ed and State Board scale the idea of MTSS, because it was sort of getting billed as like just another initiative or another RTI. You know, the department's renamed RTI again, and really this, because of the movement towards local control and the local control accountability plans, it was really good timing to bring this a little bit, to make it bigger than that. And so $10 million was initially allocated for one or a pair of county offices to help develop a resource bank and help scale MTSS, because as you know, our structure in California are our county offices of education that are, there's 52 of them, right? 56? 50 something. I need to find that out in my new job. 55?
51.
Oh, 51. Okay, we're all wrong. 51.
There are 7 single district counties.
Thank you, that's what it is. Okay. So it's their job really to be the regional entities, educational entities, to help us out in the state to make sure that everyone gets the information, because in California it's pretty hard. So that first $10 million it was really going to help build the research and bring that all together in a way that people could access it, and to help the department also have sort of one place, because in the department there's a lot of divisions that have their own, they're working on MTSS from their own lens, whether it's through after-school programs or from the behavior perspective. But this idea of MTSS in California is really, today we're talking about the broad perspective where we're marrying behavior and the academic side, so that we can help our districts intentionally plan, not just around their own resources, but how are they looking at their partners in helping to provide the different levels of support for their students in tiers 2 and 3 as well. So the first $10 million went out to Orange County and Butte County as partners, and they have just really embarked, just in the last few months, they have partnered with the SWIFT project at a University of Kansas, Wayne Saylor's project, and are really using this like a new iteration of the SAM model, I believe, to help districts look at how they're including students from the full continuum more closely in general ed, or at least getting access to general ed curriculum. So that first $1 million is going out as $2,500,000 to local districts in the first round, and then a new $20 million was allocated, and $19 million of that is going out in grants. And so what I want to let you know today is there to keep an eye out for that, because sometimes having a small pot of money in your own districts to be able to convince your superintendent and your staff to develop a leadership team to look at it through this lens is just that little carrot that you need in order to turn that switch. So really excited, and I think the $30 million is a pretty big signal. And we've been hoping for a long time that California would signal that we want to do something with MTSS, and now we sort of have a base to do that.
The evidence-based practices model continues, where one of the issues that we recognized in teacher preparation was that our general ed resources really need to be used as early as possible, and that we also get the support for technology that would be needed for all of these various efforts that are happening around the state, including moving to Common Core state standards and using assistive technology. So I did both of those.
The one other piece I wanted to mention is around the implementation of our state standards, and that tucked within those and within the frameworks that describe how to teach what needs to be taught within the standards is an access chapter, as well as universal design for learning sort of filtered throughout both the ELA, ELD, and math frameworks. And so that's another place to talk to your local districts about, is how they're going to ensure that our teachers start getting professional learning, our existing teachers, and Teri will talk about our new teachers, to make sure that they understand what universal design for learning is, why co-lesson planning is so important, so that we can set that good tier 1 so that our special educators can build on that for more inclusive environments.
And so here's Teri.
So the commission is doing a lot of work to try to get new teachers and new school leaders prepared to be able to work with our students. One of the things, and Maureen alluded to this, is we used to have what we called stacked credentials, where you had to be a general education teacher first, and then you did additional preparation and you became an education specialist. And then originally you had severely handicapped, learning handicapped, those were the categories. And those were changed back in about 1998, and we had a shortage in the state of teachers for special education, and so we actually made the special education credential an initial credential. In our standards, it did not require as much preparation for how to plan units, how to teach lessons to the whole class, how to assess the whole class and use that information for planning your lessons for the next day. It had a whole lot in there about how to make accommodations and modifications for individual student needs. But what we had is a whole lot of teachers going out who understood how to work with one student or a really small group with individualized needs, but they were not as expert from the Commission's requirements at planning and teaching. And that is really a problem. And that's the reason that special education teachers who were prepared between about 2003 through now don't get a general education authorization, is because they were not prepared to teach. They did not have to do a content-specific pedagogy for the content area. Actually, special education teachers were allowed to satisfy content knowledge in any content area. And at one time, 40% of our special ed teachers were using the health exam to satisfy content area. And it is not all because they were doing the moderate severe and because they were all going to be work with medically fragile students. They were doing the health because the health exam was the easiest one to pass. And they weren't able to pass the math or the English or the science or the multiple subjects, which covers all the main core areas, including human development. I would say that the multiple subjects exam is probably a really great exam for prospective special education teachers. So we were siloed. We were hugely siloed, not only in the K-12 world, but also in the higher ed world. In our education departments and colleges of education, we had the teacher education division and we had the special education division, and they were separate in an awful lot of places. They didn't talk to each other. We're starting to break that down. The report from the Special Ed Task Force was titled One System for All. We have 6 of our institutions who've been working with a national grant out of the CEDAR Institute, that's CEEDAR, has some great resources on their webpage. If you do a Google search for CEDAR with 2 E's, you're going to get a lot of really good information. And those 6 institutions are working at completely redesigning their teacher preparation and infusing into their admin preparation for school leaders the idea that we all have to work together to understand and how to work with children. So we're going to be ensuring on this slide that all new educators understand universal design for learning, multi-tiered system of supports, RTI, positive behavior interventions, restorative justice practices, social emotional learning. We have just adopted in June, the Commission adopted revised teaching performance expectations that will address all teachers for their preparation, and they all will have to have knowledge across these areas. Our general ed teachers in our state, they're prepared with almost nothing about MTSS or RTI. They just weren't. It wasn't in our standards. So some institutions that were out in the K-12 world and saw school districts said, oh, we need to start talking about some of this. But it was not common. It was not consistent. Every single program that prepares all educators will be talking about all of this. This 16-17 year is a transition year. By 17-18, the programs have to be completely doing this, everything on this slide. In addition, the teaching performance expectations, which the Commission adopted, are going to define what we call a common trunk of preparation, so that all prospective teachers would take common classes together for these topics, and then there'll be specialization classes afterwards. In this idea, we have the adults working together, learning together, talking together, and when they've made those relationships and they understand each other, and then they go to do their specialized preparation to be an elementary teacher or a math teacher or an English teacher or a special educator, they'll still have that common foundation that they went through together, that they completed together. So we're really excited about this work. We think it's going to be huge. It's going to be a really fundamental change in teacher preparation. One of the things we kind of have to mention is the Commission has zero authority over people who are already credentialed. There are no requirements in our state now at the state level for professional learning for teachers. Those were removed in a 2006 law. And so all of that is local. It's up to the local employer, the local district, and the individual teacher to decide what they're going to do for their professional learning. So we need the department to be really, really helpful and proactive here. I'm looking over here at our next director of special ed and the professional learning division, and we have really close relationships with those, and we work very closely with them. But we need their help in this. Another recommendation, I'll ensure that all new special education teachers are authorized to instruct in both general education and special education. The commission is very comfortable with that as long as the individual has done the preparation for the authorization they're getting. We cannot just give every current education specialist that was prepared in this initial program that did not have long-term lesson planning, unit assessment, all of that kind of information. We can't just hand them a general education authorization. We're going to have to figure something out. And I know that the added authorizations in special education have not been popular, but in reality, that was one kind of patch approach to help fix this, because a long time ago, prior to 1998, it used to be you only had to be authorized if 50% of your class had a disability, and that's not right, and it wasn't right, and we're so glad it was changed. If one student in your class is an English learner, you must be authorized to teach English learners. If one student in your class is on the autism spectrum, you must be authorized to teach students with autism, and that is the right thing to do. Unfortunately, that message got out kind of slowly. Some of the LEAs didn't get it right away. Some of the teachers didn't get it. And so these new added authorizations were designed so originally we did not cover autism in our programs. As of 2010, every single special educator is prepared to teach all students on the autism spectrum. It doesn't matter which type of special education you're preparing for. And in our new standards, the TPEs that were just adopted, our general educators will know more about the autism spectrum and working with students. So that's really important. So as long as we have the preparation, the commission wants the person to have the authorization. This is especially in the area of reading, because right now, special education teachers are prepared to teach reading in the same way that elementary teachers are prepared. So we're working to make sure that we can make sure special education teachers are authorized to teach reading to any student, because they've been prepared to do so. So we have to amend regulations to allow that. In-depth understanding strategies for academics, behavior, physical, and healthcare needs. That may have been the recommendation for just special education teachers, but the commission is implementing that all teachers need to have everything in the second idea on this slide. So I think the commission has kind of broadened what the recommendation was. Another one of the recommendations had to do with ensuring special educators are trained in assistive technology, augmentative and alternative communication, as well as supporting transition for students and their families. Again, we've gone a little bit beyond that. Assistive technologies appears in our TPEs for every teacher to know about. All teachers who are prepared this year, and especially from next year on, will have assistive technology information in their preparation.
Say what a TPE is. You said TPE, and I don't know.
Oh, teaching performance expectations. Those are the statements of what does a teacher need to know and be able to do on the day they get their credential. Teaching and preparing a teacher used to be kind of a, well, I kind of know it's good, or I kind of know it's not so good. It's kind of like that pornography statement from way back in the past. I don't know how to define it, but I can tell you if I see it, it's pornography. And it used to be, I can't really define good teaching, but I know if I watch you, I can tell you if you're a good teacher or not. No, California is way beyond that. We have defined what the expectations are for teachers. Just like in the K-12 world, we have academic content standards for students. In the teacher preparation world for educators, there are expectations for what teachers can do. You may have heard of the California standards for the teaching profession. Those are the ones that are used in the employed world, the standards of practice. In the teaching performance expectations, that is the CSTP, but it's magnified. Right at the time they get their credential, what are the things they need to know and be able to do? So it's a really important set of expectations. Ensuring that paraprofessionals and instructional assistants are well trained, able to do the part of the career pathway to becoming a special education teacher. There's some legislation on this topic. Part of the challenge here for the commission is the commission has no authority over any paraprofessionals or instructional aides or assistants. There are no licenses for them. The commission doesn't do anything. That means it's all done at the local level. There is a bill that was signed as part of the budget. We're going to be working, there used to be a paraprofessional teacher training program where paras could go to college and get some funding and get a teaching credential and get some supportive funding. There will be a new classified teacher preparation program getting ready to go, and any classified employee in a district, doesn't matter if they're an aide in a classroom, if they're a lunch lady, if they're a bus driver, if they're a custodian, anyone who's a classified employee who might be interested in becoming an educator, there'll be some state grant funds out there to help them support getting their last 2 years of college and getting their degree and getting a teaching credential. So even though we're not doing this necessarily the way it's written, we are actually doing some work that is very closely related to this topic. So, this is the summary slide of what have we done, and I think I've talked about most of it. They did adopt new teaching performance expectations in June. They're developing a new TPA for general education teachers, and actually we need to amend that bullet now, because in June they also said prospective special education teachers should also pass a teaching performance assessment, which is an actual event of teaching, not giving the prospective teacher a paper and pencil test that they go and take in a testing center. It is instead the teacher candidate plans a lesson, they submit their lesson plan, they teach the lesson and videotape themselves, they reflect on the lesson, they submit some student work that has been anonymized from the lesson, they analyze the student work, and they tell you what they would do differently. At the June commission meeting, the commission said, general education teachers have been taking a TPA. They have had to pass a TPA since the 08 year. It's not appropriate to be licensing special educators who have not done a performance assessment. They also need to do a performance assessment. It's not a performance assessment, can you teach special education students? It's can you teach? It's the general ed part of the program. So we will be preparing that, and special educators in a number of years down the line will need to do a TPA. We have an advisory group that we're getting ready to convene, and I think, yes, coming next, I'm going to give you information so you can apply to that, or you can give information to people who might want to apply to be on the advisory committee, because we've defined the common trunk. Those are the TPEs. We know special educators are going to have to do the common trunk, but what we need to do now is we really need to figure out what is beyond the common trunk. So if all prospective teachers are doing all of these things, MTSS, UDL, they're doing restorative justice practices, they're understanding social emotional learning, they're doing all of this in their common prep, what do they do extra to get the special ed license? What do they do extra to get the math license or the multiple subject license? We know the general ed extras, those have been defined. We're going to work on what are the special ed extras. So we're forming this special ed work group. Applications are available. There's on our webpage, and if you can't find that, you can always email me and I will just shoot you a link right back to the link. We're going to look both at two different things, the special ed credential structure. Currently, California has one of the most complex. We have 7 different initial special ed credentials, and they're based, except for one of them, very specifically on the federal disability categories. And the recommendation was that that is too many divisions, it's too many differences. We need something that has more commonalities. So we're going to look at what is the appropriate special ed credential structure. And then second to that, what are the knowledge and skills that prospective special education teachers need to have when they get their initial credential. The applications for this group are due in early September, and it will be about 20 to 30 people. It will involve preparers, current educators, administrators, parents. It involves the range of people to do recommendations to the commission on this topic. It's very exciting, I think. I'm ready to turn it back over to other people for the non-commission work. This is what we have to do. Education in California is very complex, and we have to be able to network and work with other agencies.
Well, so one of the other recommendations that we did is looking at the IEP process for students, because if we want them to come out and be effective learners at the end, we really need to make sure that the goals that are written into an IEP for an individual child are aligned with our California state standards. There's lots of help out there now for school districts to do that, and Kristin can give us an update on what the department's doing about that.
So the department has been committed to try to bridge the great divide, especially for students with more significant disabilities, that around the requirements that every student regardless of the severity of disability, have access to their grade level standards. And so despite a student maybe not being at grade level when tested, they are still by law required to have access to their standards. And so you may be remediating in an area, you may have a student, my daughter's a good example, who's in the 11th grade, who may be at a K-1 literacy level, but that doesn't mean that she has no access to 11th grade state standards. And that's been tough to sort of break that down, because when you look at what the standards are, they're really complex and there's a lot of them. But what I'll tell you is, and this is even from doing our own IEP, is that because the standards are built on stair steps, that you'll see a lot of commonalities that run as a thread between all those standards for each grade level. So it's not that hard to back map. And so, and there's also a lot around communication for all of our students to build on as well, which we know has been a huge barrier, especially for our students with more significant disabilities than our students with autism. So, so the department's been working with some of its contractors to help to develop some modules and some other resources to help sort of bridge that great divide. And in terms of assessment, I don't know if you all are aware that we have some new alternate assessments for our students with more significant disabilities. So before we had the regular assessment or the general ed assessment, a California modified assessment that was kind of like a tweener, and then the alternate assessment. Well, the feds came back in the last few years and said, no more modified assessment. Most of your students should be able, with accommodations, to take, which is now our Smarter Balanced state assessments, at grade level. So regardless of where you are academically, you are taking your grade level assessment. And that's true also for the alternate assessment. So you can imagine, and the reason I'm bringing that up now is that if our expectation, and we're testing our kids at grade level standards, we actually have to give them access to grade level instruction. So that is a huge priority for me coming into my new role. It's very tied to high expectations. It's very scary for some of us parents, and I think for some of our teachers, because it puts a lot of pressure on all of us to really raise the bar. But hopefully we'll see sort of the tide changing around that. And while I don't believe that a single assessment's going to save the world, what assessments do is they put an expectation in place and help to drive a conversation. So.
I think you should just keep going on this one.
All right. So, and that really does segue well into ensuring parents are kept informed related to statewide testing and standards. And I think this message that I'm talking about around understanding that even if your child is there are districts that have independent living, like ILS tracks, even if you have a child on that track, those children are still responsible to have access to their grade level standards in ELA and math and science. And we'll be tested on that just to ensure that. On the compliance end from the Department of Ed, when we go out to districts and we look at IEPs, we are looking to see that there's not a second grade standard in there that's driving that IEP. We're looking for, if you're an 11th grader, we should see 11th grade standards highlighted. It may be a standard that's broken down into stair steps, but it's there. Otherwise, those IEPs are not compliant.
We had an assessment committee as well, and at the time when we started this process, we had the California alternate performance assessment, and we realized that if that was not going to be allowed to be continued, that we really needed to work at developing something that was aligned to the California state standards and was adopted newly. So in this case, those are in fact happening at the department level. And then okay.
I just wanted to mention that at the last state board meeting, the assessment division at the department came forward to the state board and asked their permission to embark on some new thinking around standardized assessment for students with significant intellectual disabilities. And that currently we use the California alternate assessments, which are end-of-the-year summative assessments based on grade level standards. We are required, because of the new science standards that are just coming to fruition, to create a new science assessment. And since our requirements are that all students are tested in English language arts, math, and science, we're required to develop a new science test. And the science standards, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at them, and I recommend you do, are very, very complex and deep and very critical thinking based and problem solving, which is all wonderful and fantastic. But for some of our students with more significant intellectual disabilities, it's very challenging. And testing them at the end of the year on all these things would also be very challenging for our students and our teachers. So the recommendation of the department to the state board was that they develop a performance embedded assessment, which would allow teachers to be able to, as they're teaching the students, to be able to test them and use proof points as they go along. So as we're doing a lesson, in biology or chemistry or whatever the standard is, that we are able to teach that lesson and then assess that the student knows, and then we have a proof point for that lesson, and that becomes part of a portfolio that is then used on a rubric to ensure that those students along the way have learned all of those skills, which I think is really exciting and innovative around testing, because it really, in many ways, empowers the teacher, and it's going to provide our special ed teachers and general ed teachers with a clearer roadmap on exactly what is expected to be taught, and to the point where the state may be assisting in developing some lessons and other things to help teachers sort of break down the complexity of that science. So I think that's an exciting piece, and we've struggled, I know in my own daughter and the folks we know with kids with more significant disabilities, in that summative testing, that trying to encapsulate what you've learned over a whole year with someone who, you're struggling with communication is really, really tough.
So I'd like to take a minute to particularly thank Mike Kirst. He's the president of our State Board of Education, and he has been such a great leader in this about really looking for accountability for all students. And so, one of the things that they've been doing over the last multiple years is this transition to the smarter balance assessments. And so one of the pieces that we looked at, of course, was, well, what do you do for those students who need some kind of either an accommodation or a support or what? And so the recommendation was that process really look at, are we doing what we need to do to be effective in that way?
And as part of the current assessments that are happening, there are studies happening that happened as part of the last assessment, Smarter Balance assessments that took place this spring, to look at what kinds of access students had, what kinds of accommodations were used and on the tests, because there are different tiers of accommodations. There's ones that are universal that anyone can use. There's ones that teachers have to turn on, and then there's other ones for students with disabilities that are available on top of just whatever other accommodations individual students need. So I invite you to tune into the Advisory Commission on Special Education, which meets next week on the 10th and 11th, and that's a webcast from the CDE website. They go by ACSE, they call it ACSE, and that's our state panel. There'll be presentations, including one by Teri, by it's kind of all of what's happening in statewide policy around special ed, including a presentation by the assessment division on exactly what, I think they're bringing back some of the data about what was used for accommodations, which should drive a conversation about how much more do we need to train our teachers and families about what's available, and that continues to evolve.
So the next group was the accountability group, because we wanted to make sure, of course, that any recommendations that we came up with actually were going to make a difference for children. And one of the great frustrations that special educators and probably all educators have is that we have had different data systems to work with. So we do one kind of reporting, and then general ed has a different one, and often you look at the data for one child and it's actually not the same between the two, and so there's mistakes. And so there was a big recommendation that we really try to get this together, and we really do have good news to report on this one.
So I'm told that the CDE is in the process of aligning those systems, and that CalPads will include all information on students, because what's happened in the past is we've had the special ed system of data that was reported, and then the general ed system of data, and some things went over into the general ed system and some things didn't. And so, as you know, with a state this big, when you have two systems of data reporting, you may not always have the same exact data, which is troubling, and not anyone's fault necessarily. But in terms of, if you're thinking specifically like about suspensions and expulsions, which have become a big hot topic, having one reporting system for those will be very helpful, especially since the state has really moved into more of a unified accountability system. And so one of the big things, and that I see as very hopeful around this one coherent system, is the unification of our accountability system. In the past, we in special ed have a lot of federal requirements under the IDEA to report and sort of do that in our own world. And then the general ed side has all their things that they report, and they report some special ed things like number of students with disabilities and sort of how they've done as a large combined group on assessment and that kind of thing. Special ed over the last year, and largely in part due to the task force and our leadership being committed to this unified idea, have really brought special ed to the table around accountability. And so in the past, we've had different targets. We've had our federal targets for special ed, and then we had everyone else's targets. This year, the recommendations going to the board are around having everyone have the same targets, and that if we have high expectations for all, that we're measuring everyone together and accounting for everyone together, so there's no confusion. It's much more streamlined. So really looking forward to being part of those conversations, because it's hard for districts. You get mixed messages when there's a target for your IDEA and then a different target for the state overall. So CaseMIS and CalPads is in the process of being merged, which is great.
Sorry. And just to be sure, because we tried to not use acronyms, and you just can't not use acronyms in special ed, but in case you don't know about CaseMIS is the California Special Education Management Information System, so really the data group that school districts have to report on all of the required data for kids. And CalPads is the bigger data system that the state uses on all kids. So now the idea is that they will be one. So another issue was that at the very same time that our task force was working, the federal government was coming up with what they call results-driven accountability, or RDA. And what they had recognized was that the push from the federal government to include students with disabilities, to do the best we can for students with disabilities, as it was focusing on compliance, was really not necessarily making enough difference. And so they said, you know, if what we want is by providing these services that what we get are results for kids, then that's what we need to focus on, are these results-driven accountability. And so the task force recommended that we really try to work in a nice coordinated way, that we would be able to have our reporting responsibilities match that framework and be better for kids. Okay, and so Kristin had already mentioned that one. So we do have all kinds of reporting requirements, and so under accountability, we wanted to make sure that all of these were integrated better, particularly within the education system, but also across agencies, because we do have to do all these different reporting things, and the idea should be that it's because we want to make a difference for kids, so we wanted that to be better integrated.
So it's always better as a parent to practice what you preach and have your kids role model you. They're really trying to start doing that at the Department of Education. I've witnessed it, been in meetings where all the different divisions have been getting together under this Blueprint 2.0, which is the superintendent's sort of plan for the next few years. And a big piece of that is the cross-division integration. If you're a school district, you know that that we all have different requirements, and we send different teams out, and we have different expectations of different pots of students. What we also know is, as Maureen talked about earlier, that 70% of our students with disabilities are also other things, including Title I and EL and the groups that go out to schools. And so we've started having those conversations at the Department of Ed, first to just really make sure that we're all using and agreeing on the same terminology and definitions of terminology. And, I would say everyone we're all well-intentioned, but we all come with our own lens and our own background in our own specialty area. So as we expect districts to work in a multi-tiered system of supports fashion, we're trying to help design ourselves in the same way, both at a greater level in the state as well as at division levels, and like the special education division is also trying to organize itself more in that way. So if we're a resource to the field, then we should have those universally designed tiers, that tier 1 where you can come to us and you can find what you need and get the information you need. And that'll happen through our collaborations with partnerships like the SEDS and all the folks who work with our students with disabilities that are really vast and broad. So in terms of the positive movement from that end, hopefully that will also, that will help our LEAs also. I say LEAs, I just want to go back and tell you that I say LEAs because when I say districts, it doesn't always sound like I'm including charter schools. And LEAs, local educational agencies, are inclusive of county offices, of charter schools, and of school districts, so, and SELPAs, so I've been trying to use that term.
I would like to give kudos to Glenn Price at the Department of Education. He's the relatively new deputy superintendent who supports Tom Torlakson, and then Tom also for helping us through this process. But Glenn has been a real leader in helping the department come together across systems and help get this work out. So I think you'll see progress. It's just we still have some way to go. So I told you we didn't have a subcommittee on family and student engagement, but we just had so much conversation about family and student that we did separate out our recommendations into a family and student engagement area. And we had 3 recommendations here. Depending on where you are in the state, your school district is part of either a family empowerment center or a family resource center. And we asked that there be better funding for those so that their services would be more accessible to more families. And we also asked that there be funding for the alternative dispute resolution where all SELPAs would get funding to actually support that, because it was only 15 or 30 of the SELPAs who got that grant, and we wanted it to be included.
And this is certainly an area that you could be showing your advocacy efforts with your legislators. But currently, I think there's 14 family empowerment centers across the state, and there's some areas like Sacramento that doesn't have one. Our closest one, I think, is Chico. Is that right, Kelly? And intentionally, the legislator, back when these were established, had expected that there would be 32 across the state to better hit every area, but those have just never been fully funded. So the 14 that have existed for quite a while are still the 14 that exist under the current budget. And the only thing that would likely change that would be legislation or an additional budget allocation to allow for there to be expanded, and in which case there would be a request for proposal, and just like the ones that were established initially. But the good news on the SELPA front around alternative dispute resolution that has proven very successful across the state is now available to all SELPAs. So that allocation was made in the budget as part of the nod from the governor after the task force recommendations were released.
That there be some guidelines put out so that teachers and parents could better collaborate in order to support our families and students. We did have the student member of the advisory commission worked with us on as a member and as an input provider, and so we got some really good student input from a student, but then also we had, I think we counted more than half of our task force members were parents of kids with disabilities, and maybe another role too. When we looked to get those 34 people, we were trying to get the cross-representation around the state. We really wanted to get parents, but it would have been great if you were also African American and a school psychologist and a parent, because then we could get more perspective into the people. So we did want guidelines to be developed for better family relations.
And there's some advocacy groups that have really taken this on. I understand there's some great new information coming out of PTA and some of our other advocacy organizations that, just like Andy was talking about this morning, that individual groups are not individual groups alone. They really cross over many different things. And so our ability to be a student that receives services under Title I and also as a student with disability and many things allows us to advocate and bring along a lot more people into the conversation. So, so I know as the new state director, I plan to have the collaboration between parents and families be a huge focus and really try to beef up that kind of interaction and transparency and communication and be a little more user-friendly. So, so also that's taking place right now is a dyslexia work group that is really cross-agency, and this was birthed out of a lot of frustration by parents of sort of being in that gray area, not being able to qualify for services, but knowing that their kids needed help and not being able to get access to the expertise that they needed. And so a really incredible group of individuals is meeting together to set up guidance in the state around this issue.
Probably the group that had the most difficulty was, of course, the finance subgroup, because that is a big concern. If you talk to any special educator in the state, they'll tell you that one of our problems is we don't have enough money to do everything we'd like to do. But I will say that they also worked very hard to ensure that they listened to all the rest of the subcommittees so that they could support recommendations. So, for example, that please better fund the family resource centers and family empowerment centers came out of the finance group, but it's in the family section of recommendations. So what the finance group did was say, we really need to overhaul special ed financing and make sure that our school districts are accountable, but that we actually get better funding in order to better support the kids. And you addressed the PPIC study a little bit earlier, but the fact of the matter is our state board did not include children with disabilities in their original local control funding formula idea because they wanted to wait for really this group's set of recommendations. So we made our recommendations. They haven't been included in the LCAPs, and now they're saying, the governor and the board have said, we really need this study to be done by the Public Policy Institute to say, look at all the recommendations from the task force, look at what else is going on, the board's input, and let's get some recommendations. So, for example, there was one of the pieces of legislation this year was to better fund our preschools, special ed preschool dollars, woefully underfunded, but literally we were told that's going to go on hold until this study is done. So my understanding is that the study is supposed to be out by about November, and they have been interviewing school districts around the state and parents and trying to gather all kinds of information on you name it about special ed funding. So hopefully you'll hear more about that into the future. And then did you want to do the advisory commission?
Sure. I know we only have just a couple minutes left, but I do want to say that, and I invite all of you to really tune in to the Advisory Commission. Again, it meets next week, and you can come to see it in Sacramento. This time it's being held at the Holiday Inn on Capitol Mall, but typically it's held at the State Boardroom. And the Advisory Commission is California's state panel. In order for us to receive federal dollars, every state has to have a state panel. Ours is in statute, in state statute, meaning that not only is it, does it serve as our IDEA panel, but it also serves to advise the legislature, the governor, and the state superintendent on issues related to educating students with disabilities. So it's a great place if you have something, a great idea or something that's really bothering you, it's a great place to come, to get really educated about what's happening from the policy level, but also to be able to give your input. There's always public comment there, as well as at the state board meetings. And I'll tell you that we would love to hear a lot more from stakeholders, teachers, parents, families, students, because our voice is not a very loud voice in the overall statewide conversation. And we're hearing a lot from other stakeholder groups, and ours is very, very quiet. So would love to hear more people coming out and at the state level and having our voices be heard. So they, as a response, developed a disability equity rubric that we're using with other statewide, like legislatures, or the legislature, and they've provided to policymakers so that as they're developing, the whole idea is instead of having a separate everything, that when we're developing policy, having that thoughtful inclusion of students with disabilities in that conversation can prevent a lot of things from having to be corrected later. And so as they're developing a program, some kind of, any kind of program really, but education programs specifically, that you're figuring out what those entry points are for students at different abilities, and that those programs don't preclude any students from disabilities in being able to participate in them. And there will be some upcoming appointments. I don't know that there'll be one this coming December, but the following December, if you're interested, the governor, the Assembly, the Senate, and the State Board of Education all make appointments onto this advisory commission. It's a 4-year term that you serve, and you can Google Advisory Commission on Special Education in California. And it really is a great place if you're interested at all in anything that we've talked about today. We really recommend, it's really great having people that come from the field and parents that come in. We're required to be 51% parents by law. It's great having people that have been experiencing all this come in and being able to really put policy and practice together. And so really invite you all if you're interested. I'm happy for you to email me or call me in my current role at the State Board if you are interested, and I can tell you more about it. So again, you can, at the state level, there's a lot of places to give input. Especially over this fall, we're going to be developing our entire statewide accountability system and the rubrics that we use for our local control accountability plans. This is a place where we really need the voice of students with disabilities and their families. We will not be included if we're not there. We just won't. So you can also encourage your own districts, we talked about earlier, and schools to really have inclusive preschool options. That's where we're really setting the tone for the future for our entire districts, as well as being involved in the development and redevelopment of your local control accountability plans. That's where, on paper, you should really see how your district has prioritized what it's doing. And if it doesn't say anywhere on the whole LCAP that they're addressing the needs of students with disabilities, then that's problematic. It should be very intentional that they're addressing the needs of those students, especially when you ask your district for the data. You want to know, how are students with disabilities doing? Where are they? We keep all that data at the state, and your districts keep all that data too. And I would say it's really critical and probably your best entree in to ask them to run their own overlap of subgroups. It was very enlightening at the state when I had that in my hand and I brought it into my meetings and people thought I wasn't really part of the conversation, and I said, well, actually 30% of our kids are English learners and 60% of our kids are socioeconomically disadvantaged. So we bring in special ed a lot of resources that can help the kids that you all think that we're not. So we do have a ticket to the table, so I really encourage you to do that. I think that's where we can all have the most impact. And so if you want to look at the blueprint that the superintendent has put forward, you'll kind of get an idea about what's being focused on at the state level. And there's the task force report link as well. If you have any other questions or I can help you in any way, I'm kwright@cde.ca.gov. And all of the CDE emails are our first initial and last names. Please feel free to reach out. We're always looking for great ideas and also of places that are doing really cool things, because it's easy to tell someone what they're not doing, but it's really nice to be able to say, and by the way, there's a place that's doing something that's really great that you should talk to.
I want to say one more thing about the task force. On this task force report link, what you're able to get by going to the San Mateo County Office of Education website is a link to the full report, but also to an executive summary in case you don't want to read 84 pages, or to the subcommittee report. So for example, Patty was on our early learning subcommittee, and the early learning subcommittee did its own full report. Educator preparation did its own full report. So there's a lot more information on the website for use in your advocacy as well as in your understanding of what it is that we have to offer.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.